Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's virtual program with Turnstile Tours. I'm Andrew Gustafson. We're so happy that you're joining us today to talk about canals. So we're going to be joined in just a minute by our colleague, Stefan, and we're going to have a conversation about lost canals and continue a long conversation we've had over the last 2 years about many different canals, but we're going to take a different look and look at some of the forgotten or never built canals here in New York City. But Stefan, welcome.
Hello, good to be here. Always happy to talk about waterfront things with you.
Yeah. And so, this program, I know one of the things that sparked it for me was just looking at old maps. And we're going to do a lot of that today and talk about where the map sort of diverges from reality in a lot of different cases. But tell us a little, just real quick, tell us a little bit about how you got so interested in canals, because it goes way back with you, right?
Yeah. I mean, as we've talked about in other programs, including our recent one on the ferry boat JFK, native of Staten Island. But so New York is important to who I am. But I was raised in a house in a hill in Pennsylvania in the 80s, like you did. And that was very close to the Lehigh navigation. So canals were around me all the time. It was one of these places where there's the river next to the canal, next to the railroad, next to the old farm road, next to an interstate. And, history laid out before you. During college, I wound up working my summers at the National Canal Museum, where I steered the boat and I drove the mules and I gave the tour, not all at the same time, but my colleagues and I all took turns doing that. And yeah, that made a big impression on me. I got very into the canal history. The reason the National Canal Museum is in Easton, Pennsylvania, is there were three canals that came together there, and we've talked about them. The Lehigh navigation a little less than the others, the Morris Canal and the Delaware Canal, which were mostly about moving coal, which is important to canal history as we know it.
Great. And you're going to give us a little bit of sort of a background on a canal, because what a canal is and a little bit of their history here in the United States, because we're going to talk a lot about sort of that age of canals, the early American Republic and prior to the real explosion of railroads. But a lot of the canals we're going to talk about today served many different functions, right? So I'm going to pull up those slides here.
Right.
So we can.
Yeah, this is important. I mean, we all kind of know what a canal is to some degree, but a lot of the canals we're going to talk about today aren't canals like we might think about them, or in the way that we've talked about them when we're talking about the Delaware and Raritan Canal, for instance. So really, basically, a canal is an improved waterway, and that may be used as for moving just water with irrigation or drainage, or it might be used for navigation. It might be in different kinds of navigation canals. Sometimes they differ in the way they're made and the where they go. Some of them are formerly unnavigable waterways that have been channelized for reliable edge and depth. And a lot of our rivers, particularly in the West, have kind of become almost like a canal, where they have locks on them for navigation and they have pretty hard edges in a lot of places now. Our real prominent example of a formerly relatively unnavigable waterway that's been channelized is the Gowanus Canal, for something familiar locally. Otherwise, we have ditches that have had that went where there was no water before, that connect navigable waterways alongside an unnavigable waterway. Much of the Delaware and Raritan Canal follows the Raritan River, and so that kind of is describing what's going on there. They kind of built a ditch next to the river where the water was too shallow. They also would, as with the Lehigh navigation, build dams and create a slack water. But again, we're organizing a waterway and improving it through engineering to make it navigable. And then you have
where the water was too fast, right? So we've also another canal system that we talked about on a previous program was the many canals built to navigate the rapids of the Connecticut River, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah. That's although fast and as fast as unnavigable. So whether it's too shallow or it's too fast, it's unnavigable for whatever reason. And then you have ditches extending across inland, again, with the Delaware and Raritan going from the Raritan River over to the Delaware River. You're crossing a watershed and watershed ditches, water ditches connecting navigations across watersheds. These are typically fed by reservoirs. A big one we've talked a lot about is the Morris Canal, where they're making reservoirs and lakes. And this is also true on the Erie Canal, that are at a high point in the canal system and send their water down both sides of the canal system. So basically, we're talking about an engineered watercourse with fixed edges and typically minimal current. But about the history of the canal, these go way back. Of course, early canals were used for irrigation, goes back to Babylonian times. The oldest and largest canal in the world remains the Grand Canal in China, which is kind of a conglomeration of smaller canals, some of which go back as far as 486 BCE. The canal network, as we know it, really was kind of finished construction in 609. Then China, of course, was way ahead of Europe with a lot of technological advances, but Europe kind of caught up in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. And canals as we know them really came together in, I believe it was 1761. You have the Bridgewater, I'm sorry, 1761. You have the Bridgewater Canal in the UK, and that sets off a canal mania. The Bridgewater Canal was built for moving coal, and that was really what drove the need to move this really heavy material, which couldn't be dragged across the land very easily, but was valuable enough that it was worth making a whole new transportation network to move it. That really set off the canal mania that swept England and some of Europe as well. In addition to the canals, the urban canals in places like Amsterdam and Venice. And then America catches up. We had canals going back pretty early. There were sort of channelized waterways in Boston back into, I believe, the 18th century. But the Erie Canal is the big one that set off a U.S. canal mania, in no small part because it provided access to the Midwest, and that set up New York as the prominent port for the Atlantic seaboard, and all the other cities that had been big ports, Baltimore notably, were trying to catch up and start building their own canals. The whole canal era, so we have a good 30 years that 20 to 30 years that people are building a lot of canals in America. But by 1872, railroads had come up enough that not only were we not building canals, but the canals started to decline. 1871 was the peak for traffic on the Erie Canal. And 1899, there was a study done on the Erie Canal that clearly demonstrated they were not losing money, but making less and less money every year. And that activated a bunch of political activity that led to the construction of the New York State barge canal system, which was largely in place by 1917, though they were still building terminals in New York City as late as 1922. And that's a big part of the end of our story today. 1929, the Great Depression kind of wiped out the remaining canals. A lot of them had given up to railroads earlier on, but except for the Erie Canal, the last canals were pretty much wiped out by the Depression. And canals are still, of course, important. They've become parks, and for the more extant canal system in the UK, that's become an important release for people, for a place to go to get out of the house during the pandemic. And also, as housing prices have risen in London, there's no place to moor a boat in London anymore because the canals are so packed with people living aboard to find a cheaper way of paying rent. So canals do remain with us today in a sort of a traditional way that we think about it. But a lot of them have gone by the wayside and been filled in, both in New York City and across the country.
Yeah, so that's a great introduction. Thank you for that. So let's dive in and talk about some of these examples of lost and forgotten and unbuilt canals, because we've talked about some of the big ones before. both the ones that connect New York City, like you mentioned, the Delaware and Raritan Canal, the Morris Canal, the Erie Canal. And then also we've done a couple programs about the Gowanus Canal as well, which people in Brooklyn are very familiar with. But we wanted to dig in to look at some lesser known examples. Here's a map, speaking of canal mania, that shows sort of this vast network that was being built during the Great Canal Rush in the pre-Civil War era. But again, you can see here, this is the Morris Canal here. This is the not yet built Delaware and Raritan Canal, and of course the Erie Canal we can see up here and connecting to the Champlain Canal. And then the green that you see here is railroads that would soon overtake them. Yeah, so let's start with Gowanus. I think it's important to note as well, while in the 18th century is when the canals became a really important part of the English Industrial Revolution. New York was settled by a bunch of Dutch people who knew a lot about canals.
That's really important context. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Good.
Oh, I was gonna say, and they settled this area where we can see. So this is the Ratzer map from 1767. Really the most detailed early map of Brooklyn, and you can see the somewhat natural water course of the Gowanus Creek, but it's already started to have improvements to it, right?
Yeah, we talked about that in our program about tide mills. We see some tide mill dams built here on this map, and both in what we think of as the Gowanus as well as in what we think of as Red Hook.
Yeah, and here we can see one of the oldest canals. This one was chartered in 1660, which sort of connects these meandering waterways through here, through the Gowanus Bay, connects it up to the Buttermilk Channel up here. And that was built so that the farmers around here, they didn't want to have to navigate around this hook right here. So it was sort of a shortcut, but also a safer way to navigate. And so that's why what you can see from looking at the map does not look like a natural water course here. But so this is one of the oldest lost canals, and it disappeared. It was around for almost 200 years. It's, according to records that we have, it disappeared probably sometime around the 1840s with the construction of the Atlantic Basin.
And that roughly follows the route of Hamilton Street there. So it's
Yeah.
You'll see that again and again. The canals, of course, they want to do as little digging as possible, so they end up following very low routes, and those routes will turn into railroads, but they'll also turn into roads and highways as well.
And we'll talk about more than one canal street that exists in New York City.
Peter's asking if the canal in Red Hook had a name. Not to my knowledge, but
so the sort of water course that it roughly followed was called Bull Creek. So it was referred to as Bull Creek or the Bull Creek Canal. Yeah.
So here's another, of course, we briefly mentioned Newtown Creek, which is effectively a canal, and the Gowanus Canal, which is also a channelized creek. And here we're looking at another, technically, it's referred to as a canal. I guess it meets our definition. It's more of a rerouting of a waterway here. This is up in Inwood at the top of Manhattan, and where the Harlem River cuts across part of Manhattan, and we end up with this sort of the oddness of Marble Hill. So this is
right over here.
Rival. Yeah. So there's Marble Hill, that little island sort of looking spot to the north. Marble Hill still, if I recall correctly, still politically part of Manhattan, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we shouldn't call this a lost or forgotten canal, because, the Harlem River, people navigate it all the time, but we've sort of, I think, forgotten that it is a canal. It's the Harlem River Ship Canal. As it was built, to connect to the Hudson River with the East River. So we thought we'd throw this one in here too, because lots of people don't realize that it's a canal because it doesn't really carry that name.
You see the looping old waterway over above Bubble Hill there. I learned recently that that was filled in pretty late with the till they pulled out of the excavations for Grand Central Terminal.
Oh, wow. Amazing. Yeah. And of course, this is a very important railroad corridor right here. When we did a tour of this area on a boat, and that virtual tour went a little bit longer than we expected because we had to wait for the bridge to open because there was a little, some of the trains that were going over were delayed, but yeah.
So not a lost canal, but now we're going to get into canals that are no longer navigable, no longer extant, including a couple you can walk on top of. So this is Lower Manhattan, back when it was New Amsterdam. And these channelized creeks again, aren't they?
Yeah. So here we can see the Castello plan, which shows, you know, the settlement of New Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan, and you can see the wall of the eponymous Wall Street, and you can see a couple of these waterways here. So this is it was called the Heere Graft, or what we know today as Broad Street, and it extended along Broad Street from Beaver Street. But there weren't a whole lot of canal boats that were going up and down this waterway. This was really a drainage ditch for all the effluvia of the settlement to go out of. So, and there were a couple examples of this in the early settlement. And so, if we take a look at it,
also have the Beaverwick. There's the other blue line there, the which is now Beaver Street, and so that's a tributary of the original.
Yeah, and I think you can see them here. So this is the 1865 Egbert Ville survey of Manhattan, which what you can see is in the green is sort of the original topography and hydrology of the island, and then where it's been expanded, you can see in the orange. So this was sort of the proto Manhattan project here. But another important waterway, or a very important body of water here, was the collect pond, and draining the collect pond was Canal Street. So we can't see the waterway that was here, but in the early 19th century, a canal was dug to drain the collect pond out to the Hudson River. And so that was around for about 20 years to fully drain it. And again, basically an open sewer that was eventually filled in, but retains the name of Canal Street today.
Well, I think it might be more useful to talk about it as covered over than filled in entirely.
Yeah, sure.
There are. I wasn't able to dig it up for the show, but I've definitely seen videos out there on YouTube of people sneaking through manholes and exploring in the waterway there, which it's a covered sewer, but it still has water running through it today.
Yeah, and I think it's an important fact that natural hydrology is very difficult to erase. It often comes back, even despite our best engineering efforts to overcome it. So, for example, we can see on this map, you can see the old shoreline runs along Water Street. You can see here, and when we have a big storm event and storm surges, that's about where the water reaches usually. So, the same thing happens with surface water that we've covered over. Those streams, in many cases, still very much exist, but in a subterranean form.
Yep.
And often only emerge again.
That abundantly clear, where all the places that flooded and people's basements and first floor apartments that flooded were typically in places that were ponds and streams and swamps.
Peter had a question here. What is the pond south of the collect pond? I think he's referring to this one. Do you recall the name of this? I don't.
I don't recall the name offhand. I know it was basically obliterated by the Brooklyn Bridge, but it's kind of under Pace University. It's right there at the base of the Brooklyn Bridge. But the name I don't recall offhand.
I have to grab my copy of Manhattan. Definitely have it.
It's actually under my computer right now. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So again, these examples you see here in Lower Manhattan are not navigation canals, but as Stefan mentioned, canals can also be used for irrigation, or in this case, drainage. But this
Gosh, it's
is
now an
one of the
actual
first
canal with boats.
yeah, yeah.
And
So what is this place we're looking at here?
well, this is the Bronx. This is the Mott Haven Canal, and this connects to what we were just talking about because we were just talking about Canal Street. And one of the ways, and I should note that if you want more information about hidden waterways, including hidden canals, a great resource for this is the work of Sergei Kadinsky and his Hidden Waters blog and book, and so lots of great information there. And on all kinds of hidden waterways, including these. But this one of the ways that he looks for hidden waterways is in the street names. Places like Andrew referred to Water Street, or streets that are named after streams, and there are canal streets in let's see, Manhattan, the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. So four of the boroughs have canal streets. Just as far as I know, Queens doesn't have one. So there are these two canal streets in the South Bronx, and they mark a canal that was dug into the Bronx Peninsula and was a terminal for canal boats until, well, the last part of it wasn't filled in until the 1960s.
And I
This
think
bit, yeah, I think
map here you can see.
There we go. This is a little unusual for a canal. Again, it wasn't a channelized creek, so this canal had a tide gate on it, so they maintained a navigable level of water within the canal. This one doesn't show the canal going its full length. When it was first dug, it went all the way to 144th Street, and then was filled into 138th Street, and then later in the 60s, like I said, filled in entirely. Yeah, it was like a lot of canals in New York, their stories tend to end with the canal was declared a health hazard and therefore was filled in. And that is what happened here.
Yeah, and we also have an image of that lock here.
Yeah, it attracted a number of artists, the Mott Haven Canal. And so there are a couple of prominent prints and paintings based on the canal, including this one.
Speaking of another canal street, we'll go to the opposite end of New York City from the Bronx. And so this is Stapleton in Staten Island, right?
Yeah, a neighborhood we talked about recently on our North Shore of Staten Island program. And not a canal we know a whole lot about. There's still a lot of room for research here, but Canal Street is still there. And Sergei Kadinsky has been able to find a stream that ran through there. But clearly the streets are following a really hard-edged path. So there's a suggestion of something a little more formalized around that stream. One thing that we do know about this neighborhood, it was a major center for brewing. So that may or may not have an impact on the story of this canal. But if you look up, do any kind of a search on canal in Staten Island, you'll pull up Stapleton pretty quickly.
Yeah. So again, this is actually one of the earliest sort of street maps of Richmond County and Staten Island. So we don't know what the sort of fate was, or if in 1874 this brook was still there, or is this sort of a shadow that remains on the map? And we'll see other examples of that where they, even though the waterway on the surface has been obliterated, they still put it on the map.
See, Bob is asking, he notices the Seamen's Retreat there in the bottom right of that map. I wanted to know if that's Snug Harbor. This is not Snug Harbor, but a part of it's a predecessor to Snug Harbor. Snug Harbor opened, I believe, in 1830, and this was set up as a Seamen's Retreat. I want to say 1801. It eventually became the Marine Hospital, and so there have been that building that you see on the map there is still there. And they're forever trying to get it landmarked, but it's also had many additions to it that remain a hospital today.
Yeah.
Right, so more canal streets. This one's going to take us to Brooklyn and down to Coney Island. We mentioned a canal dug across the salt marshes in Red Hook. About that same time, this is the mid 18th century, there was a canal dug across a little spit of land near the town of Gravesend. At that time, Coney Island was not an island. It was a bunch of little islands, much like if you look at the barrier islands all along the south shore of Long Island, you'll see that there are inlets cut through the wave action cuts through the sand dunes, and these islands are always changing shape. And that was the case at Coney Island as well. It was a whole series of islands with a peninsula at the end. And so in the 18th century, I believe 1750, they cut what they called Jamaica Ditch across that peninsula to aid in navigation so that boats didn't have to go out in the swells. You're just off of Breezy Point, there's a major shoal. It's pretty dangerous navigation. If you've ever taken the ferry out to Far Rockaway, you may have seen the breakers on the ocean side as well as on the Coney Island side. So to avoid all that, they cut through the peninsula. And so there was a canal there for quite a long time. They developed that canal further and there were grand plans for making a quite substantial canal in the late 19th, early 20th century. And they started building the street grid out around that. So there today are two stubs of the canal street that was planned for what they termed the Gravesend Canal.
And before we go to the next, a newer map, I just wanted to mention something about this map from 1852. We'll be sure to share a link to this map because it's one of my favorites. I use this map all the time. It shows basically all of Brooklyn. Yeah, there's just a lot of great little details here. Peter mentioned that the name Shell Road is interesting and apt. You can also see a lot of the hotels popping up along Coney Island. I believe the first one opened about 30 years before this, so it was already a burgeoning industry here.
And as we talked about in a previous program, there are tide mills in here as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so here we can see it's becoming much more rectilinear, a much more sort of solidified shoreline and shape. And so at the top, you can see a very, very straight line cutting across basically the passageway of the Coney Island Creek, where it says Gravesend Ship Canal right here. It's a little hard to read, so right here.
And of course, today that area does have a pretty hard edge on large sections of it. This is the area where there's a plan to bring a ferry into Coney Island at the west end of Coney Island Creek, as we call it now, and what sort of was the Gravesend Canal. But the north side of that canal over in the park is a great ship graveyard. So it's a diverse place, but pretty industrial and derelict, and of course also has its issues with combined sewer overflow.
Yes, and Lewis just mentioned that in the chat as well about how Newtown Creek and Gowanus Creek were heavily industrialized, and they suffer from a combination of both industrial chemical pollution as well as basically being open sewers, similar to Coney Island Creek. So our other two canals in Brooklyn are currently Superfund sites, and Lewis says that perhaps Coney Island Creek is a future Superfund site as well for cleanup. And so this is kind of what it looks like today. So definitely not the straight line that was envisaged for the Gravesend Ship Canal, but definitely a lot of places where you have hard bulkhead, either concrete or steel, for different now bygone industrial uses along the creek. But this is, I took this picture in 2013, but this is roughly the area where the ferry landing will come in for the NYC ferry. And you can see the parachute jump in the distance. All right, so that's the Gravesend Ship Canal. So kind of built, not really. And then ultimately, Stefan, what severed the water link between Gravesend Bay and Sheepshead Bay?
I mean, well, there are a couple of things that happened. For one thing, by 1924, it was clear that this canal project was never happening. So private landowners around the creek started filling things in. But it wasn't too many years after that that we wind up with highways coming through and filling in the land. And that, it's hard to come back from highways. So that was a big piece of how that all got connected.
So maybe prior to 1924, you could take a canoe between the two through the marshy area, but now you can't.
It's also a major center for horse racing. So I have to look back at the maps to see when some of the horse tracks out there came in, but a lot of them ended up on former wetlands and creating obstructions to navigation as well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I guess we can't really see them on this map here, but
we're going to take, yeah.
We'll take a look at this map. It's the same map from 1852, but the other side of Brooklyn. And this was actually the thing that made me interested in this topic, was looking at this map and seeing this body of water right here. So this is known as the Wallabout Canal. And this, as depicted on the map, never existed. So this is definitely wishful thinking put on here. But there were plans, and some portion of this was actually constructed. So the vision was to connect Wallabout Bay, and not just the Navy Yard, but other commercial activity on Wallabout Bay, with the Newtown Creek over here, which you can see today. It's very much basically entirely channelized, but you can still see some of the natural water course here and the wetlands still existing here. You can see, but the water is depicted on the map ends here, and then you can see it says intended canal right here. Even though this part wasn't built, I guess they could have more solid plans, because this is the city of Brooklyn, but this right here is the border with the city of Williamsburg. So I guess Williamsburg hadn't signed off on it, so they could just put it down as intended canal, but it hadn't actually been chartered yet. But so this project began in 1838. Is the earliest records we have of the charter for it to be constructed. And then 1852 is when construction sort of started in earnest, but as far as it ever got was here, right here. So you can see it's Hughes Street, which is now spelled differently today. Now it's Hewes, but on this map it's marked Hughes. That was as far as it would get. And so as a result, it would be known not just as the Wallabout Canal, but more commonly known as the Kent Street Basin. So it was much more sort of like a turning basin than an actual canal that connected, point A to point B. Here we can see a map of it again, and here on this one you can see the original watercourse of the Wallabout Creek coming right here, and how it connects to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So there you can see that the channel is starting to be dug, and again goes down to about Hughes Street. Much of this area here was actually was salt marsh, and that was in the process after the Civil War of being filled in. Also here you can see the Naval Hospital, and there was a request actually made by the commandant of the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1862 to actually extend the canal down here so that they could deliver patients to the hospital directly by boat. That doesn't look like it ever happened, and this area was ultimately filled in and became part of the hospital. And then eventually this whole area would be turned into the Wallabout Market. Here again, you can see it a little bit later. Again, this is as far as it got. And again, the original course of the natural stream bed, you can see right here as well. And I've, from this era, prior to the expansion of the Brooklyn Navy Yard in World War II, which would basically bring the Navy Yard right up against the canal. We've only been able to find one photo of it, which we'll see in a second. This also you can see, so here now we can see the Wallabout Market and the Naval Hospital, and then over here is the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and there's a bridge right here. And so the bridge went over the canal. Interestingly, in preparation for construction of the Wallabout Market, there was a Wallabout committee that was created, and they had a budget to do improvements around this area and improving the streets and infrastructure for the construction of the market. And I believe it was in 1867. They submitted a report and said, yes, all the work has been done, all the money has been spent. The bridge was in desperate need of renovation. And then members of the Common Council of Brooklyn went down there and they said, this is the exact same bridge, and literally nothing has been done because all
of the money go, Andrew? That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So all of the money was stolen, but eventually a new bridge was built there. But this was, a major thoroughfare coming into the market, and this bridge was a major impediment because it had mechanical problems, and there were boats coming in and out of here all the time. And so there was actually a proposal that was also made to build a tunnel underneath the canal, so that traffic could go under it. But the only image that we have from this era of it as an industrial canal is this one from 1914. And I think just in the far, far left edge of the photograph, you can see a little bit of the bridge right there. But again, a lot of what was on here, as you can see from the writing on the buildings, was moving coal. Coal and lumber. There are a number of lumber mills in this area as well. But eventually, by the time of World War II, where this guy is standing right here, he would be standing inside the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and the Navy Yard would fill in a portion of this canal up as far as Clymer Street. And this is what it looks like today. So today, this little stub of a stub that was the Wallabout Canal is called the barge basin. And so this was used primarily for bringing in construction material for the expansion of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But today, we don't really have any active industrial users that are on this barge basin. The only user of it is who you can see here, which is the New York City Harbor School. And so they use it for cultivating oysters for the Billion Oyster Project, where you can see this sort of semicircle right here of buoys, which is where they grow oysters that have been hatched at the Billion Oyster Project in Governor's Island, and then they grow to adulthood here in the barge basin, and eventually are taken out for repopulating reefs around New York Harbor. One other important thing to note about this this body of water, because it has been mentioned already in this program, and that this is also a huge outflow point for combined sewage overflow. And so basically the main outflow point for the Newtown Creek wastewater treatment plant is actually down here. And so we get about 600 million gallons of untreated sewage and rainwater mixed together that is deposited in here. But the oysters can handle it. Yeah, so that's the little bit about the Wallabout Canal. So don't trust maps that you look at from the 1850s and 60s. If you're looking to find the course of the Wallabout Canal, or a lot of improvements, because again, they were frequently put on maps before they were completed. We had a couple questions here.
Oh yeah, interesting comment there. Bob says should be said the Erie Canal built up Brooklyn rather than Manhattan, and it's true that the Brooklyn did see a lot of development from canal boats for local distribution of grain primarily. Unfortunately, we just lost the last of the infrastructure from that. There was a warehouse at the mouth of the Gowanus Canal, which was aggressively allowed to fall apart and catch fire and So we no longer have that, but it was the last piece of infrastructure from the towpath era of the Erie Canal, and the SW bound warehouse was primarily for local distribution of grain. For international grain shipments, a lot of that was transferred in Manhattan directly from canal boats through floating grain elevators into ships going, the ocean liners and other ships going to foreign ports. But clearly the Erie Canal was second to cotton as a resource for the economy of the harbor and the port, but was a significant part of the economy of the port. And Lewis is asking about Jamaica Bay and whether you want to call Jamaica. Oh, I see Bob is also asking about the East River and is this a canal? And those are fascinating questions. I think I'll leave that to other people to debate the canalness of those waterways.
Yeah, so I wanted to, I mean, since we were talking about grain, we should also just acknowledge the fact of the Red Hook grain elevator, which was built as part of the New York State barge canal system, which you mentioned before, which never really reached its full potential by any stretch of the imagination.
That whole, yeah, the barge canal, we'll get into that more shortly, but yeah, there's a lot of unrealized potential and sort of betting on technology that didn't go the way people expected it to.
But our next canals we're gonna address both the East River as well as Jamaica Bay.
Absolutely. Yeah, so going way back into the early 19th century, this canal was something that people really wanted, connecting Newtown Creek to Flushing Bay. And of course, a lot of the reason for that was because of the Hell Gate, which we've talked about in other programs, this dangerous piece of water. Dangerous because Long Island Sound and the harbor, there's typically a difference of about 3 hours between their high tides, since it takes a lot longer for the high tide to get to New York City through the East River than it does through the harbor. And so that little narrow passage you see there where it says Hell Gate has very fast water and historically a lot of rocks. We've talked in our tide mill program about the rocks that were used for a tide mill because the water was so powerful there. And the federal government put a lot of money into getting rid of some of those rocks in the latter 19th and the late 19th century. A huge explosion that took out the largest of those rocks and helped with the navigation, but it still remains a difficult passage today. And that's a big reason for a longstanding interest in this canal connecting Flushing Bay to Newtown Creek.
And I wanted to mention here from this New York Times article in 1895, this is an appeal to Congress to authorize the funding for the construction of this ship canal. And they gave two main reasons for it. One was it says, quote, all the efforts made in the past to remove the obstructions of Hell Gate have failed to make it a safe channel. And then the second is the flow of water through the canal would cleanse Newtown Creek and clear away all stenches that emanate from that breeder of pestilence.
Common sort of, it's funny that they should think a canal would clean up Newtown Creek. Canals, like I said, in New York were constantly getting declared hazard to health and closed down. But again, that tidal action, and this became an issue with other plans to connect the East River and Long Island Sound by canal. Having a reasonable flow of water that's not too fast is key to the success of a canal. If it goes too fast, then it's not useful for navigation.
We can take a look at the topography to see a little bit closer about where this canal may have run. So in the bottom left corner, you can see a little bit of the Newtown Creek. And so this canal would have run roughly, Stefan, right, from the bottom left to the top right.
Yeah, there were a couple of different plans for canals running through here. And again, the primary goal was to get to Flushing Bay. So a lot of the plans, you can see these dark lines running just above Queens Boulevard and then through that intersection at Woodside, where there's a I mean, that just happens to be the point that they're marking on this topographical map, but that gives you a good guidance for the slope that they're avoiding to reduce the number of locks that they need. But we'll talk in a moment about a plan that had the canal following Long Island Expressway. Again, this is a very low area where there was a tide mill at one time, and that was there was an alternative plan to build the Newtown Creek Flushing Bay Canal, connected to a much more ambitious one connecting Jamaica Bay and Flushing Bay.
And this is an idea that came up a few times over the centuries, but this is perhaps one of the most preposterous proposals for it, that also, encompasses a complete remaking of the land masses of New York, including, as Lewis mentioned, he says the East River is a saltwater tidal estuary and cannot be stretched called a canal. That is correct, but in this case, they would fill it in like you would just any old canal, right? Filling in the East River, extending the southern tip of Manhattan to envelop Governor's Island. And then you have New Harlem River, basically cutting off the northern tip of Manhattan, and then the New East River. I think this is probably quite a bit straighter and wider than they could have hoped to build it. But
I get the sense it's about the same width as the Illustrator's eraser.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously a very fantastical idea, but parts of this were sort of in the news recently. So Jason Barr is a professor at Rutgers, had this idea for New Mannahatta, you can see here, and it looks very, very similar to that plan for the southern tip of Manhattan.
I hate that we're giving them any oxygen on this idea.
Yeah, I agree. If people think about waterfront and infrastructure things, you probably heard about this last month, so I thought I'd throw it in there. But yeah, so tell us about the route for a more realistic canal to connect Flushing Bay with Jamaica Bay.
Well, personally, this route is very meaningful to me because it's tough to get across that terminal moraine. We talk about that all the time when we're talking about Brooklyn and Long Island, that this is Long Island is the result of glacial action. And so where the glaciers ended, it dropped a lot of rock, and that rock made this ridge. So you had to climb up over Prospect Park across this terminal moraine. There's this big hill running down the middle of the island. There are some places where there are valleys. There are little dips in that. And one that I love because it gets me from here in Flushing to Jamaica Bay pretty easily is right where you see all the highways coming together at Jamaica Center. And this is about where they wanted the canal to go through. I'm always, I should be used to this now, but it never ceases to amaze me just how deep into Long Island Flushing Bay and its salt marshes go. That's what you see there at the top. That's the Longmeadow Marsh, and that's part of Flushing Meadows Corona Park, and it comes about halfway across the island before it runs into the terminal moraine. And then the other side, going through Kew Gardens and into Richmond Hill, down Lefferts Boulevard, it's a pretty gentle slope. It's not that big a challenge to get across, but it does present a challenge, both for digging the canal across this route, and then of course dealing with your tide differences. I think we've got a couple of other maps that help.
And to give context, right? So for the northern part, Flushing Bay in the early 20th century, there was a fair amount of industry that was there. There was a barge terminal that was there. Not so much the case on the other end of it, though. So there were ambitious plans to transform Jamaica Bay to turn it into a major industrial and commercial center.
Yeah, really where this gets traction is with the reconstruction of the Erie Canal as the Erie Barge Canal. So here we see Jamaica Bay with Far Rockaway down there at the bottom. And if you think about the rest of Long Island, there are all these barrier islands, as we mentioned, talking about Coney Island. And when they built the barge canal, sort of doing the superhighway take on the Erie Canal, there's all this money going into that development. And so this is in the, again, the 18 teens, about the same time that America as a whole was getting very excited about maritime, and New York in particular, as we got to the construction of the Panama Canal. So with the anticipated increase in shipping through the Panama Canal, there was this renewed focus on maritime, this notion that we needed to improve our docks in New York and expand them, because it was anticipated this would expand the port's commerce significantly. So taking off from the idea of the Erie Barge Canal, and with this notion of increased traffic coming to the port, there were plans to extend and improve other canals around the state, going north up beyond the Hudson Valley toward the St. Lawrence, but also running a canal behind the barrier islands all along the south shore of Long Island. And then this canal that would connect Jamaica Bay to Flushing Bay through that terminal moraine, and really set the stage for Jamaica Bay becoming a major port. So here we have the proposed Jamaica port, the port of Jamaica Bay, with barge terminals and all kinds of infrastructure. This was also tied to plans to connect Long Island to New Jersey by railroad, and those go back to the 1890s as well. There's a plan we're still talking about today. I believe there's an environmental review that's been funded to, and this connects to our upcoming show about the Interborough Express. There is a plan to dig a tunnel from the south end of Jersey City, just above Bayonne, to basically where the Brooklyn Army Terminal is. That's a route currently served by car floats, barges that carry trains, which we've talked about on previous programs. So there was this move to connect Long Island to New Jersey directly, which would also serve this port. There was, as we get into the late teens, early 20s, there was a plan, partly something that Erastus Wyman of Staten Island had worked hard to bring together, a plan to put a subway and combined subway and freight tunnel from Bay Ridge to Staten Island, which they actually started digging in the early 20s. And I believe it was Mayor Hyland who put a stop to that. But reasonably, because a lot of the funding for that tunnel was supposed to come from the B&O Railroad. So when they pulled out, that put an end to that. But you have all these pieces coming together to support this project of connecting Jamaica Bay and making it a major port. The canal that they plan to go from Jamaica Bay to Flushing Bay, cutting through that terminal moraine, kind of also harkens back to some of our current issues with infrastructure, whether we dig a ditch or whether we cover things over. There were competing plans with engineers who wanted to do the cheaper option of digging a ditch through the terminal moraine, and the borough, which wanted it to be a tunnel, which would be much more expensive but preserve the street grade. But my favorite thing about this is that, of course, the port didn't happen, in part because Robert Moses opposed it becoming a port. He very much wanted this to remain a parkland. And of course, the money from the state and then the federal government didn't come through to build the canals. But we're having these huge shifts in technology, moving away from canals. Railroads are in their prime, but we're also, even just a few years after Kitty Hawk, seeing planes come in here. And it was see if I can get his precise title here. There was an official in the state, the second deputy commissioner of docks and ferries, a city official who wanted to see one of these barge terminals, basically located where JFK is today, made a seaplane terminal. So we're already anticipating Jamaica Bay as it became today.
And then, of course, we have JFK over here on the east side of Jamaica Bay. And on the west side, we would have New York City's first airport, which would be on Barren Island, which today is known as Floyd Bennett Field. So aviation would definitely become a big part of Jamaica Bay's future, for sure.
And I can't help wondering what would have happened if those rail connections had happened, or if the money had come through from the state or federal government to make that canal happen. If Jamaica Bay had become a port, and we, particularly if we had those rail connections, would containerization have happened here and not in Newark Bay? And what would our city look like in that case?
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting because Jamaica Bay is such an important, uh, nature preserve, wildlife refuge, and to have that be look like Newark Bay be quite different. Yeah, it's really
Chalk one
interesting to
up
think
for
about.
the positive column for Robert Moses there.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Yeah, and Bob Levine mentions as well, there is a push to turn Jamaica Bay into an oil receiving port. So there, yeah, there were a bunch of proposals starting really in 1906, and then running through the 1930s, and into I think there were even proposals in the 50s. Is that right for modernization of Jamaica Bay? But the ultimate ones
Absolutely, absolutely.
happen.
There's yeah, the islands and the tidal marshes of Jamaica Bay have been cut and recut multiple times, and lots of these channels built in. We still see the effects of some of the industrialization of the edge in places like Perdigat Basin and Mill Basin that have hard edges and extended deeper into Long Island than they might have otherwise.
And of course Dead Horse Bay as well.
Hey,
Yeah, yeah. And I think this is a great note to end on, which is something that a comment that Lewis made. He says, with a desire for more green transportation and also ideas for increasing the use of our marine environment for barging, et cetera, to reduce truck traffic, do not be surprised to see more ideas for possible future canals in the metro area. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that has been on the drawing board for the city for a number of years to try and increase more maritime traffic. But yeah,
but also interesting that we've seen these plans in the early teens, and this is the same time when the subways are happening. And this was the last moment that you could really do something new and big and land intensive in New York, because once housing had extended to the outer edges of the boroughs, it makes everything so much more expensive to do anything new with eminent domain.
yeah, yeah. But it is, I think the we'll always be a port city. We'll always be a waterfront city, and I think it's great if we can come up with new ways to leverage and utilize our waterfront, especially because we are seeing such a huge increase in the number of trucks on our streets, for especially last mile deliveries, and that's hugely impacted one of the neighborhoods we talked about at the beginning of the program, which is Red Hook and Sunset Park. So if some of those trips could be done by water, that would be ideal. And if some of those trips could be done perhaps by a cross harbor rail tunnel, and not come over the George Washington Bridge, that would also probably be a good thing. But
Yeah.
so great, Stefan. Thank you so much. This was really fun and great conversation. We covered a lot of ground, and we covered all 5 boroughs as well. So there's a lot to cover in an hour.
You got
Thank
such
you so
great
much.
questions and ideas
Yeah.
and comments. Really appreciate Lewis particularly, and also Bob and Howard and everyone who chimed in. Really appreciate all your contributions.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we'll follow up with some resources. You can always find them on the show page on our website. So we'll definitely post Sergey's blog, which was invaluable for this program, and also some answers to some of the questions that we weren't able to tackle in the moment. But thank you all so much. Join us next week for our program on March 7th, where we're going to talk about that Interborough Express. And then on March 18th, we're going to take a look back at the past 2 years. But thank you all so much, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I know it's a difficult time for a lot of people, a lot of things going on in the world, and so it was nice to take a little break from all that with you, Stefan. But our thoughts are with all the people in Ukraine right now. So thank you all so much, and have a great day.